And war correspondent Chuck Holton joins me now to talk about his new documentary, Armenia, A Love Story. Chuck, thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about it.
Yeah, well, obviously, this is a topic near and dear to your heart. And why don't you, before we get into exactly what's going on here in this documentary, tell me how you became kind of connected to the story of Armenia.
Yeah, well, I'm a war correspondent and have been for 20 years. And so in 2020, when I was contacted by some of my viewers who are Armenian, and they were asking me, why don't you go cover the war that's happening in Armenia? And I really didn't know where Armenia was, and realized that once they educated me on the conflict, wow, this is something I really need to cover. And so I went in 2020. And of course, you know, like most people in America, I didn't know where Armenia was. I didn't know anything about the country, but I got there and found out that it's a staunchly Christian country in the middle of the, Asia. This is Western Asia, and it's surrounded by Muslim countries who their neighbors pretty much all want to see them destroyed. So it's a lot like Israel in that way, that everywhere they look, they see enemies. And they're looking at an existential struggle. This is a struggle for the survival of their country. It's a very, very small country. As a matter of fact, there are almost as many Armenians in California as there are in Armenia. So, the Armenians are a fiercely proud people, but very devout Christian people as well, the world's first Christian country since 301 AD. And so it was just kind of amazing to me that more people don't know about it, especially when I got there and I found out how beautiful it is, how cheap the accommodations are, how good the food is. I mean, this is the kind of tourist spot that should be up there with Rome and Paris, but nobody knows about it. So I just thought what Armenia really needs is more people to know that it exists. And so that's why we made the documentary.
All right. And tell me about this documentary, Chuck. What's the premise of it? How does it unfold?
Well, it started out just being a documentary about the war. The Armenians, there is a group of Armenian people, about 300,000 of them, that live in an exclave inside Azerbaijan. This is kind of complicated, but when the Soviet Union broke up, there were pockets of Armenians that were living in Azerbaijan and pockets of Azeris that were living in Armenia. And so they created these exclaves. There's 5 exclaves in Azerbaijan and 5 in Armenia. It's really weird and complicated. Those 300,000 people living in what they call Artsakh, or what the rest of the world knows as the Nagorno-Karabakh district, were suddenly and brutally attacked by Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan saying, we are going to wipe out the Armenians in that area and retake that and repopulate it with Azeris. And so they were fighting for their very survival in that area. Now, that's an area that's a little bit removed from Armenia proper. So many of the people fled from Artsakh to Armenia. And so going there and seeing just the devastation that caused by just absolutely indiscriminate bombing and shelling by Azerbaijan, and with the help of Turkey, trying to wipe out those people and to just make it so miserable there that they would all leave, was really something to see. And again, people in the West just didn't know about it. It was right at the height of the election season in the United States, so it didn't make the news over here. And people just felt abandoned. There are, these are our Christian brothers and sisters. And I think that, if anything, we should be praying for them and supporting them and their right to survive and live on the land that they have occupied literally for millennia. Azerbaijan is sort of a false construct in that it didn't exist as a country until 1917. It was created by Stalin with the express purpose of sort of being a thorn in the side for Armenia. And that means that there's this conflict that's going on there, and it hasn't stopped. The course of that war was 44 days long of active hostilities, and the Armenians lost 5,000 men in that 44 days. It's just a horrific number. So I went to cover that, and I wanted to make a documentary about the conflict, but do it through the eyes of some young people rather than through my own eyes. I'm a bit jaded, having covered wars for 20 years. So I got my daughter and one of her friends and took them into the war zone shortly after the ceasefire was signed and let them interview the people who had been affected by the war. And it was much more visceral and emotional that way. However, as we went along with filming the documentary, some very serendipitous things happened. And as it turned out, my family fell in love with Armenia, and my middle son decided to move there. And before long, he had met a girl and was wanting to get married. So we call it Armenia a love story, but it's really 3 love stories. It's how I fell in love with Armenia through the war, how my family fell in love with Armenia when I brought them back to film the documentary, and how my son fell in love in Armenia with an Armenian girl. And so it's really a story of hope. It's not a depressing story about the war as much as it is a proof that God can bring something wonderful and beautiful even out of the worst of times.
That is incredible. And again, not shocking, by the way. You mentioned that the media, a lot of people, it doesn't hit the radar around the globe. And when you hear that there's a large Christian population there, not entirely shocking. But the world, by and large, they're not that familiar with the Armenian genocide. In fact, you had world leaders who wouldn't acknowledge it. And I don't know which ones. You probably know which ones have and which ones haven't. But I know that was a point of contention for many, many years. So, I mean, so this is also kind of a history lesson too, is it not?
Oh, of course. Learning about the Armenian genocide, it was something that we were never taught in school. The Armenian genocide, we learned about the Holocaust, but as it turns out, the Holocaust might not have happened if it weren't for the Armenian genocide, because Adolf Hitler specifically referred to the Armenian genocide in 1915 to 18 as justification for wiping out the Jews, because he said nobody even remembers the Armenians anymore, so we can certainly get away with killing the few Jews. And when you go and you learn about the history of the horrors that were visited upon the Armenian people, you can see why they are so tight-knit today, why they are so patriotic, why they are so fiercely pro-Armenia, and very much still hold a grudge, because they're still only really one generation removed from people who were there during the genocide. And you talk to people that have been through those kinds of horrors, and it's understandable why they would hold some animosity toward the very people who not only did their ancestors try to kill your ancestors, but they are actively threatening to finish the job. I think that's the big thing. But one of the things we tried to do in the movie was to point out that Armenia's history came about as a Christian nation by an act of forgiveness. There was a saint named Saint Gregory the Illuminator who was preaching the gospel in Armenia. And at that time, it was, this is in the 300s. At that time, it was a very pagan culture. And so he was thrown in a pit in the king's palace and held in this dungeon for 13 years in the dark. Didn't see the sun for 13 years. And then the king came down with a terrible illness, a mental illness, we think. They say he was, almost like Nebuchadnezzar, going around like an animal and eating grass and things like that. And so the king's sister, I believe, saw in a vision that she should ask Gregory to pray for the king's healing. And he, even though that was the same king that threw him in that dungeon, he agreed to pray that the king would be healed, and he was in fact healed. And by that act of forgiveness on his part, the king was healed, and the king converted to Christianity, and then gave Gregory license to go throughout the land and preach Christianity to the rest of the people. They saw a great awakening in the country, and the entire country more or less converted to Christianity in 301. So that's the story that made Armenia. And there's a great parallel to that today, because nothing will ever change in that part of the world until people's hearts are changed. And the only thing that changes people's hearts is love, not hate. You can bring peace through a ceasefire. Russia can come in with a heavy hand and can cause peace to happen by just making the warring parties leave each other alone. But through the threat of force, they're bringing peace with a sword. But the hatred is still there. But if you bring love, love conquers hate and gets rid of the underlying cause of the conflict. And so that's what it's going to take to solve this problem once and for all. And I think it's incumbent upon the Armenians who have been wronged to begin that process and that act of forgiveness, to follow the example that was given to them by Gregory the Illuminator way back in the 3rd century.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And I just want to point people, they can go check out how you can watch this movie at armeniamovie.com. And Chuck, you list on the website there that the proceeds from the film sales will go to help refugees. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, every time we've gone over there, we're on, I think, our 7th trip now. One of the things that we loved, it's always the highlight of the trip. We started running tours over there. So if people want to go to Armenia, go to that same website, armeniamovie.com, and you can sign up for a tour with my wife and I to Armenia. We take each spring. But every time we've taken a tour, we find someone who has been displaced by the war or who lost a son or a husband in the war. And we go and we just sit with them in their home and we listen to them and we let them tell us their story and we see how they live. And this is something that just sort of organically happens. The people in the tour start saying, wow, these guys are really suffering. What can we do to help them? And they end up, we've done things like paying off people's mortgages. We've done things like paying for medical procedures. We've done things like building a bathroom for somebody who literally did not have a bathroom in their home. They had to use an outhouse outside. Just things like that every time. And the people who come on our tours always say that despite how beautiful it is, despite how great the food is and how wonderful the accommodation, everything, that helping the people was the highlight of their trip. And so we want to enable more people to be helped and enable more people to come. And in fact, that's really the purpose of the documentary, is to raise awareness about Armenia, because if more people knew about the country, more people would want to visit the country without a doubt.
Yeah, I love that. And I love you getting people involved and letting them tangibly see it as well, giving them that opportunity and go over there with them. I'll probably join in on one of those eventually too,
Chuck.
Hope so,
man. Come on.
I can't let you, I see you on tape there. I can't let you have all the fun for yourself, but it does look amazing there. It looks beautiful. So, and so does the film. And Chuck, I appreciate you stopping by. I encourage everyone to go check out armeniamovie.com and see Chuck's fantastic work here. Chuck, appreciate the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.